Hey guys, tonight, we journey back thousands of years to the backs of the Nile to a civilization known for pyramids, pharaohs, and gods that watched your every move, but behind the gold masks and grand temples lies a much harsher reality. Today we're asking, what would happen if you lived just one day in ancient Egypt? Because let me tell you, the sun isn't the only thing that will roast you alive, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Somewhere in the tangled timeline of human history, a medieval European woman stirs in her sleep. It's the year 1257. The rooster hasn't crowed yet, but the chill stone walls around her say morning has arrived. She doesn't own an alarm clock. She doesn't own much of anything, really. Her husband does, or her father, or perhaps the local church. Ownership is not her concern. Obedience is. She stretches slightly under a scratchy woolen blanket, hand-stitched by her mother, who probably died during childbirth. The mattress is straw stuffed into a sack, which doubles as a bed, and an early lesson in the inevitability of fleas. Outside, the bells of a nearby monastery chime, not just calling the monks to prayer, but letting everyone know the world still turns under the watchful eyes of God. A God who, according to Scripture, blames women for the fall of man. Meanwhile, on the other side of time, another woman awakens. This one is in ancient Egypt, around 1257 BCE. Her room is warm with the sun already peeking over the edge of the Nile. She rises from a wooden bed, supported by woven slats, topped with a linen sheet that smells faintly of lotus oil. Her cat blinks at her lazily from the foot of the bed. Cats are sacred here. No one would dream of tossing one outside. She pours water from a ceramic jug into a small bowl and rinses her hands, then her mouth. Hygiene is not just important, it's part of cosmic balance, part of Mott. She reaches for her kohl eyeliner and a bit of perfumed unguent. She's not vain, she's respectable. Presentation matters. Now, let's pause and consider. These two women will never meet. They are separated by over 2 millennia and thousands of miles. One lives in a society of crumbling feudal hierarchies, rising superstition, and collapsing sanitation. The other, in one of the world's longest-lasting civilizations, where scribes record contracts on papyrus and women can own land, testify in court, and file for divorce. You may be imagining the Egyptian woman as a queen, but she's not. She's middle class, maybe even lower. Perhaps she's a weaver, or helps manage her husband's business, or runs a small food stall near the temple. Regardless of her status, she enjoys more autonomy than most women would see again for centuries. Back in medieval Europe, the woman pulls on her shift, a shapeless underdress, and laces up a kirtle. It will take assistance to get fully dressed. Buttons are rare. The laces are awkward. Her mobility is limited. She's expected to be modest, pious, silent. If she's lucky, she has shoes. If she's unlucky, she has chilblains, and will spend the day scrubbing a rush-covered floor with cold hands while her husband attends mass, or drinks warm ale and talks about theology with other men. Theology is not for her. Her soul is inherited from Eve and must be purified through labor and childbearing. Over in Egypt, the other woman dons a clean linen calasiris, lightweight and breathable. The heat is coming. There are no corsets, no sermons. Her society doesn't believe she was born sinful. She's not expected to be ashamed of her body. She might even own her own land, passed down through the maternal line. She may have a contract outlining the terms of her marriage, one that ensures she retains her belongings in the case of separation. Because yes, she can initiate a divorce. And no, she won't be stoned for it. The medieval woman, however, can't even read her own marriage vows. If she tries to leave her husband, her options are, well, martyrdom, mostly. The church has firm opinions on a woman's role. Her reproductive system is her most valuable, and also most suspicious, asset. If she bleeds too much, she's cursed. If she doesn't bleed, she's cursed. If she bleeds at the wrong time, she's a witch. Back in Egypt, bleeding is just biology. The woman has access to rudimentary medical care, spells and herbs, yes, but also documented remedies that were surprisingly effective. She might visit a temple dedicated to Hathor, goddess of motherhood and music, for fertility blessings. It's not exactly science as we know it, but it's not guilt-drenched mysticism either. By midday, our medieval woman is bent over laundry, her hands raw. She has no legal identity of her own, unless she is a widow, and even then, she exists in a legal limbo. She may be beaten by her husband. The law won't object. She may die in childbirth. The church will call it holy suffering. The Egyptian woman is at the market, perhaps bartering for bread or fish. She exchanges coins or goods. She signs her name. Her husband may join her, but it's not required. If he hits her, she can take him to court. She has legal recourse, not always enforced, of course, but written into law. Her status is not defined by her husband, but by her role in the community, and in the ever-spinning cycle of life and death. They'll both eventually return to sleep, one with a prayer muttered in Latin she doesn't understand, hoping to avoid purgatory, the other with a charm of protection under her pillow, asking the gods to weigh her heart lightly. And tomorrow, they'll both wake up again, but only one of them has the right to decide what happens next. This is not to say ancient Egypt was a feminist utopia. Far from it. Women still faced limitations, expectations, and dangers. But compared to the average medieval European woman, the life of her Egyptian counterpart reads almost like science fiction. So if we dropped our humble medieval milkmaid into the streets of Thebes, it wouldn't take long for her to panic. Open markets, unveiled women, written contracts, goddesses in public statues. It would be chaos. And if we gave her a taste of autonomy, legal recognition, the ability to walk outside without a chaperone, she wouldn't last a day, or maybe she wouldn't want to go back. Either way, history is full of surprises, and sometimes they come with eyeliner, dress codes, and social armor. Let's talk about clothes. The silent rules woven into every thread, every hem, every stitch. Because fashion isn't just about warmth or style. In history, clothing is obedience made visible. It's modesty in linen. It's shame in wool. It's authority in the cut of a tunic, or the drape of a veil. Let's begin with the medieval woman. Somewhere in England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, it's the year 1292, and she's getting dressed. She starts with a shift, an underdress, usually made of linen if she's lucky, or scratchy wool if she's not. It's white, or what passes for white before soap became a regular household item. She pulls it over her head. It's plain, always plain. Decoration is for the wealthy, and even then, only the right kind of decoration. Gold thread. Fine, if your family has titles. Crimson dye. Careful, it might mark you as a prostitute, depending on where you are. Best to stay in beige. Over that, she'll wear a kirtle, a fitted dress, laced at the sides or front. She may need help getting into it, because practicality and women's fashion rarely coexist. The fabric is thick. Layers are essential, not just for warmth, but for modesty. Skin is sinful. Curves are suspicious. A woman's body is to be hidden, like contraband, under socially acceptable folds of fabric. Now for the veil, a crucial piece. Depending on her age, class, and location, she might wear a wimple, which wraps around the chin and covers the neck. It's not for warmth, it's for containment. A married woman covers her hair. A nun covers everything. A widow covers her grief, literally. The veil says, I am not tempting you. I am invisible. I am pious. The ideal medieval woman is quiet, obedient, and fully draped. Now, take a deep breath, step through the folds of time, and find yourself in ancient Egypt. The sun is already high, and the woman here is reaching for a linen dress. It's called a calasiris, a single piece of fabric, lightweight, sometimes translucent. Yes, you heard that right. Translucent. Sheer. She slips it on effortlessly. No buttons, no laces, no underlayers. It's held up with straps or tied at the shoulders. In cooler months, maybe she adds a shawl. That's it. Her breasts might show through, and that's not a problem. Modesty, as we know it from the Middle Ages, is not a concept that's stitched into Egyptian seams. This isn't to say Egyptian women strutted about in risque attire for the sake of provocation. It was simply practical. The Nile Delta is hot. Wool would be a death sentence. Clothing had to breathe. And linen, made from flax grown right along the river, was ideal. Hair is another major contrast. The medieval woman's hair is either covered, braided tightly, or hidden under a coif. She may even shave parts of it to better fit a headdress. To show loose hair is to signal youth, temptation, or madness. In some regions, it's even illegal for married women to be seen without their heads covered in public. In Egypt, it's almost the opposite. Hair is dressed, decorated, celebrated. Wigs are common, not just for the elite. They protect against the sun, serve ceremonial purposes, and often display social status. Some are made from human hair, others from plant fibers. They're braided, curled, or perfumed with cones of scented fat that melt slowly in the heat, releasing pleasant smells over the course of the day. It sounds odd, yes, but it also sounds like someone figured out how to wear conditioner in solid form, which is more than we can say for medieval Europe. Footwear is another dividing line. The medieval woman may not even own shoes. If she does, they're simple leather things, more sacks for the feet than shoes. Really, they're stiff and easily soaked. Her walk is slow, deliberate. The roads are muddy, the floors are freezing, and she is always cautious. The concept of comfort is reserved for men and monks. The Egyptian woman often goes barefoot. Sandals are worn outside or for formal occasions, but the ground is dry, warm, and clean by medieval standards. Feet are washed daily. Caluses are a form of armor, not shame. Jewelry. The medieval woman might wear a cross if she's religious, and she is always religious, because the church watches. Otherwise, jewelry is rare and tightly regulated. A brooch here, a belt buckle there. Anything too flashy invites suspicion, especially on a woman. Vanity is pride. Pride is sin. Sin is eternal damnation. Better not risk it. In Egypt, jewelry is common. Wide collars of fence beads, gold bracelets, rings, amulets shaped like scarabs or ankhs. These aren't just decorations, they are protections. They serve spiritual purposes and social ones. A woman might wear makeup too. Kohl eyeliner to protect her eyes from the sun and dust. Not to seduce, just to survive. Now, imagine time traveling our medieval woman into an Egyptian morning. The climate would be unbearable in her heavy dress. The public exposure of women's bodies, not in a sexual way, but simply practical, would send her spiraling into panic. The lack of veils, the visible hair, the use of perfume. She might faint on sight, or start quoting Leviticus. But more than that, she would feel unmoored. In her world, modesty isn't a choice, it's moral armor. A woman who doesn't cover herself is asking for punishment, divine or otherwise. In Egypt, she would see women walk freely, dressed lightly, unafraid. It would be confusing, enraging, possibly liberating, but certainly overwhelming. And for the Egyptian woman, dropped into medieval Europe, she'd be suffocated, physically, by layers of clothing she never asked for. Socially, by expectations that render her invisible. Legally, by the fact that she no longer has the right to own anything, not even the sandals on her feet. Clothing does more than cover. It reveals a civilization's fears. In medieval Europe, those fears were wrapped tightly around the female body. In ancient Egypt, while patriarchy still ruled, it did not dictate from under 10 pounds of wool. So when we ask why a medieval woman wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt, we're not just talking about heatstroke. We're talking about the psychological whiplash of seeing freedom expressed in fabric, or the lack of it. A sheer dress, a visible ankle, a confident walk. These are not fashion statements, they're social revolutions. In one world, to show skin is to sin. In the other, to cover too much might seem suspicious. They dressed for the gods they worshipped, the laws they obeyed, and the roles they were allowed to play. And for the medieval woman, her armor was not for battle, it was for erasure, marriage and misery. Let's talk about marriage, not romance, not candlelit proposals or poetic vows. Let's talk about contracts, control, and a subtle kind of prison that came with a ring, or didn't, depending on the century. Because for most of history, marriage wasn't about love, it was about property, power, and women were almost never the ones holding the pen. In medieval Europe, marriage was rarely a choice, it was a transaction. If you were a woman of the peasantry, your parents arranged it. If you were noble, your father arranged it. If you were lucky, you got a man who didn't hit you. If you were unlucky, the church told you to endure it. After all, suffering was a holy act. Now let's back up a couple of thousand years and drift down the Nile. In ancient Egypt, women also married young, often in their early teens. But there's a key difference. It wasn't just about obedience. Egyptian marriage was, quite literally, a contract, often written, signed, and sometimes even negotiated. That's right. A woman might actually negotiate her marriage agreement. Imagine that in medieval France. In Egypt, a woman could stipulate in her marriage contract that she retained control over her own property, That if her husband divorced her, or if she divorced him, she would take her dowry with her. That she wouldn't be responsible for his debts. In some cases, the contract even ensured regular maintenance payments in writing. Medieval women didn't get contracts. They got obligations. For life. Now, let's imagine our medieval woman again. It's 1304, and she's been married off to a man she's met exactly once. She's 15. He's 42. The priest says this is perfectly legal and spiritually correct. God has a plan, and apparently, it involves gout and unpleasant breath. Her role: obey, bear children, keep the fire going, endure whatever comes next, silently. Consent, not required. Marital rape isn't a crime. Her husband is the head of the household, and she is its moral center, which is a poetic way of saying scapegoat. In ancient Egypt, the story is different. The marriage might still be arranged, yes. Patriarchy is still present, but the woman might bring land, cattle, or silver to the marriage, and she might leave with it too. Divorce, while not encouraged, was entirely legal. A woman could say, "This isn't working," and the legal system would not only allow it, but often protect her rights in the process. And she didn't need to go to a priest. She just needed a scribe. Now, this isn't to say ancient Egyptian marriages were all joy and freedom. Many were strategic, economic unions. Polygamy existed, although it was rare among commoners. A powerful man might take multiple wives or concubines. But even so, women had legal standing. They could testify in court. They could own land. They could bequeath property to their children. A medieval woman, even one of noble birth, had very little legal control over her own life. Once married, everything she owned passed to her husband, unless she was clever enough to squirrel something away in a chest under the floorboards, which was both illegal and futile. Widows were a rare exception. A widow might manage her late husband's estate. She might even become a landowner in her own right, until she remarried, and the cycle began again. And remarriage wasn't always optional. In some cases, women were required to remarry quickly. A single woman without a husband was a liability, a temptation, a threat, and God forbid she enjoy her independence. In Egypt, a divorced woman could remain single. She might remarry, or not. She might live with her family, or run her own household. No one would accuse her of witchcraft for being unmarried after 30. And here's another twist. Egyptian art, particularly from tombs, often depicts husbands and wives as affectionate, even equal. They're shown sitting side by side, holding hands. The inscriptions speak of mutual respect. My beloved, my partner, the lady of the house. It might be symbolic, sure, but it tells us something about cultural ideals. Medieval art rarely affords women the same dignity. Marriage scenes show them being given away like property. The language is legalistic, possessive. And if women are depicted with affection, it's usually in religious art. The Virgin Mary, eternally sorrowful, eternally pure, eternally unreachable. In reality, medieval women were married to the church as much as to their husbands. Their bodies belonged to their husbands. Their souls belonged to God. There wasn't much left for themselves. And when things went wrong, in Egypt, there were procedures. A woman could go to court. There are records of women suing their husbands for neglect, abuse, and even adultery. In one case, a woman named Nanak sued her own children for failing to support her in old age, and won. In medieval Europe, there was no such court for women. If your husband beat you, the church might suggest patience. If he abandoned you, you were disgraced. If he cheated, well, men will be men, and women must pray harder. And what about love? Surely some medieval marriages were happy. Love isn't bound by legality, but love wasn't expected. It was seen as dangerous, even sinful. Courtly love, the idealized version, took place outside marriage, between a knight and a lady, a fantasy, a poem. Real marriage was supposed to be solemn, pious, and duty-bound. In Egypt, love poems survived. Actual love poems, written on papyrus, often from husband to wife. I wish I were her laundryman so I could wash the clothes that touch her body. It's not Shakespeare, but it's something. It's human. So what would happen if we sent our medieval woman to Egypt? She'd be confused, alarmed, possibly outraged. Wait, women can leave their husbands. Yes, they get money after divorce. Yes, they own land. Yes, and after that confusion, perhaps something else, longing, Because her version of marriage isn't partnership, it's servitude in a wedding veil. And the Egyptian woman dropped into a medieval village. She'd be horrified. Where's the contract? She might ask. Where are my rights? The answer, of course, is burned at the altar with the rest of your autonomy. To societies, to marriages, to women, only one gets to walk away if she wants to. And that's the difference between misery and mobility, legal rights and wronged rights. Let's take a moment to imagine something radical. A woman standing in court, alone, without a husband or male guardian, presenting her own case. If you're picturing a scene from ancient Egypt, congratulations. If you're picturing a woman in medieval Europe doing the same, I have unfortunate news. She's either accused of witchcraft, or she's already lost. Because legal rights, the ability to own, inherit, testify, sue, or sign, tell us not just what a society values, but who it recognizes as fully human. In medieval Europe, the law didn't ignore women entirely. It just treated them like property with prayer lives. A woman could be mentioned in a legal document as someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone's dowry, but as a legal person with agency. That was inconvenient and mostly ignored. Now let's pan over to ancient Egypt. A woman there could bring a lawsuit. She could testify as a witness. She could initiate a divorce. She could inherit property and pass it on. She didn't need her husband's permission. She didn't need her father's blessing. She needed papyrus, a scribe, and a sense of her own worth. And yes, this was more common than you'd think. Let's start with inheritance. In medieval Europe, inheritance followed male lines. Primogeniture, the passing of property to the eldest son, was the norm. Daughters might get a dowry if their father was generous. But land, that went to the boys, always. And if you were a widow, you could keep a portion of your husband's estate, called a dower, but only if no male relative contested it. If someone decided you were a witch, or simply too independent, good luck. The church could seize your land, or your soul. In Egypt, inheritance laws were more balanced. Land could pass from father to daughter, from mother to son. Property could be shared between siblings. In some cases, women even administered family estates. They weren't simply vessels for passing wealth between men. They were active participants. And they weren't just passive recipients of justice either. In court, women could appear as plaintiffs and defendants. Records survive of women bringing complaints against neighbors, relatives, even temple officials. Their cases were heard. Their words were recorded. Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost, but they had standing. Try doing that as a medieval woman. In Europe, if you were married, your legal identity was absorbed into your husband's. This was called coverture, and it meant that in the eyes of the law, a married woman simply did not exist independently. She could not sign contracts, own property, or appear in court without her husband. It was like legal invisibility, with extra laundry. Unmarried women fared slightly better. They could own property and enter contracts, but they were seen as anomalies, or worse, temptations. Widows had a brief window of freedom before society shoved them into a second marriage. And God forbid they were assertive. That kind of behavior got you branded a heretic, or worse, difficult. Meanwhile, Egyptian women could notarize contracts. They could act as executors of wills. They could serve as witnesses. And while the legal system wasn't perfect, bribes happened. Status mattered. It was structurally more inclusive of women than medieval Europe would be for another 1,000 years. There's also the matter of punishment. In medieval Europe, women were often punished differently than men, not because of equality, but because of fear. A man might be fined for theft. A woman might be branded or publicly humiliated. For adultery, a man could pay a fee. A woman could be flogged, or confined, or worse, drowned. And if a woman spoke out, raised her voice in court, argued too well, which, in Egypt, women could also be punished. Don't get too idealistic, but there were fewer public moral panics about their existence. No witch hunts, no inquisitions, no mass executions based on gendered hysteria. Being a loud, assertive woman was risky, yes, but it wasn't treated as evidence of a pact with the devil. And this brings us to a cultural truth. Medieval Europe ran on fear. Fear of sin, fear of women, fear of knowledge not sanctioned by the church. The law reflected that fear. It wasn't designed to protect women. It was designed to control them. In Egypt, The legal system had flaws. It was patriarchal. It was sometimes corrupt. But it wasn't obsessed with female silence. A woman could be heard, not always believed, but heard. There's a striking example in the story of a woman named Nebat, who owned and managed property in her own name. She was literate, signed contracts, and had the authority to represent herself in court. Her documents survive. Her name survives. Try finding the name of a random medieval peasant woman who ever stood before a judge with her own signature. It's almost impossible, because the law did not record her, not unless she was dying, or sinning, or birthing someone else's heir. And even when medieval women were allowed into court, they faced near impossible odds. The burden of proof was astronomical, and if they won, their male relatives usually took the money. Egyptian women could represent themselves. No husband required, no veil of male authority, just their own words. Let's imagine, for a moment, our medieval woman stepping into an Egyptian courthouse. She has a complaint. Maybe her neighbor cut down her fig tree. She opens her mouth and no one asks her where her husband is. No one tells her to go home. No one accuses her of hysteria. She is told to speak. The shock might silence her anyway. And the Egyptian woman, dropped into a medieval legal hall, she tries to file a complaint. The bailiff laughs. "Where's your man?" he says. She explains that she doesn't need one. The room goes still. Then they take her to a priest, because surely, a woman speaking for herself is possessed. So what's the takeaway? In ancient Egypt, women were legal entities. In medieval Europe, they were legal echoes, only visible when attached to a man. The law in Egypt was not feminist by modern standards, but it was functional. It acknowledged women as capable of choice, of contracts, of consequences. The medieval woman, she existed within parentheses. The law saw her only through the lens of someone else's rights. And so, once again, we ask, why wouldn't she last a day in ancient Egypt? Because rights are more than laws. They're a culture, a mindset, a language. And the medieval woman, she's never been taught that language. She's fluent in submission, in silence, in the art of not being seen. But in Egypt, she'd be asked to speak, and the weight of that invitation, to be a person in the eyes of the law, might break her before the midday sun. Religious roles and divine control. Religion is the architecture of a civilization's soul. But like most architecture in history, it was designed by men, for men, with women invited in only when they were silent, obedient, or saintly. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't just important, it was everything. God wasn't an idea. He was your landlord, your physician, your judge. And the church, his institutional mouthpiece, had plenty to say about your role, especially if you were a woman. Now let's step back in time, further still, to ancient Egypt, where religion also dominated society. The gods were everywhere, in the Nile, in the sun, in the breath between words. But unlike in medieval Christendom, the gods weren't exclusively male, and their worship didn't silence women. In fact, some women were the divine. Let's start with the medieval woman, waking at dawn to the sound of church bells. If she's lucky, she lives near a convent. If she's not, her religious life revolves around attending mass, saying prayers, and staying as pure as a freshly laundered altar cloth. Not that she has one. Laundering is her job, too. Religion is not an option. It is her structure, her salvation, and her cage. Her moral worth is judged by the Virgin Mary, a standard of impossible purity, and by Eve, who cursed the world with sin by daring to reach for knowledge. These are her archetypes, the saint or the sinner, the holy mother or the dangerous temptress. She may worship a female saint, but the hierarchy of the church, that is all male, entirely, irrevocably. She cannot be a priest. She cannot lead a congregation. Her role is to serve, suffer, and obey. Maybe she becomes a nun, one of the few paths where she can avoid marriage, acquire some education, and gain limited influence. But even there, her authority is capped. Even as an ass, she is still answerable to male clerics. Now let's cross the sands of time to ancient Egypt, where the sun god Ra rises over the horizon, and the air is thick with incense. Here, religion is also everywhere, but women are not just present, they are participants. Some are priestesses, others serve as musicians, dancers, or scribes in temples. Some tend to the statues of goddesses, others prepare ritual offerings, and some, the most elite, hold titles like God's wife of Ammon, That last one, not just ceremonial, it was a position of significant political and religious power, especially during the New Kingdom. The woman holding it was often a royal, wielding influence that extended beyond the temple walls. The gods themselves include women: Isis, Hathor, Mot, Sekhmet, deities of motherhood, justice, love, and war. The divine feminine is not tucked away into chastity and subservience. It is complex, powerful, sometimes terrifying. A medieval woman might call Mary her intercessor, but she cannot be her. An Egyptian woman might be named after a goddess, and serve her as a priestess in full ceremonial regalia. That said, the Egyptian religious world wasn't an egalitarian paradise. The high priesthood was still male-dominated. Temples were political as much as they were spiritual. Class mattered, always, but access was broader. Roles existed, and women were not punished for religious leadership. Now let's go back to our medieval woman. Suppose she is devout. She prays daily. She fasts. She confesses. Still, she is considered inherently flawed. Original sin runs through her bloodline. Her body is a vessel of temptation. Her voice in the pulpit is an outrage. If she claims to have a vision from God, careful, saints walk a razor's edge. Step too far, and she's accused of heresy, or madness, or possession. In Egypt, dreams and visions were also important, but more inclusive. Temples had dream incubation chambers, where both men and women sought divine messages. Religious experience wasn't gender policed in quite the same way. And literacy. In medieval Europe, reading scripture was dangerous, especially for women. The church discouraged it. Religious texts were in Latin, a language women were rarely taught. Some women read vernacular prayers, or listen to sermons. But interpretation, that was the exclusive right of male clergy. In Egypt, literacy was rare, too, but not forbidden. Female scribes existed, especially in the earlier periods. They worked in temple economies, copied ritual texts, and helped manage religious estates. Again, it wasn't common, but it was possible. In Europe, even literacy was suspect if you were a woman. Education made you suspicious, dangerous, possibly demonic. And so, what would happen if our medieval woman found herself at a festival honoring Hathor? She might faint from the sight of unveiled women singing and dancing in honor of a female deity. She might assume it's paganism, because to her, any religion not sanctioned by the church is heresy. Dangerous, hell-bound. She might recoil from the statues of Isis breastfeeding Horus, an image that mirrors Mary and baby Jesus, but with breasts actually visible. Scandalous. She might be confused by women officiating rituals. She might panic at the sight of a woman blessing an offering, because her spiritual framework doesn't allow for female authority, or joy, or complexity. Her God is male. Her saints are silent. Her body is a problem to be managed, and her voice, best kept low. The Egyptian woman, by contrast, might arrive in a medieval village and wonder why she's not allowed into the church altar, why her religious knowledge means nothing, why her prayers must be mediated by men. She might watch a nun scrubbing floors, and think, that's it, that's the role of a holy woman. She might be appalled by the fear, the repression, the silence, because in her world, religion isn't always kind, but it doesn't ask her to disappear. And this matters, because religion doesn't just shape beliefs, it shapes identity. A medieval woman's sense of self is filtered through guilt, sin, and the unattainable ideal of purity. An Egyptian woman's sense of self is connected to the gods. Even if she's not elite, she knows that divine figures share her gender. So once again, we ask, why wouldn't a medieval woman last a day in ancient Egypt? Because the religious role she's been trained for, passive, shameful, voiceless, would not make sense in a world where the divine includes her image. In Egypt, she would be invited to participate, and participation might break her or free her, but it would not let her hide. Daily work and unpaid labor. Let's take a long, sighing look at the thing that filled most women's lives in every civilization: work. Not glory, not leisure, not dramatic sword fights, just endless, grinding work. But not all work is treated equally, and not all labor is recognized the same way. In medieval Europe, a woman's labor was expected, unrecorded, and largely unpaid. The further down the social ladder she was, the more she worked, but the less she was acknowledged. A peasant woman rose before the sun, and her day did not end until long after darkness fell. She ground grain, hauled water, cooked, cleaned, spun wool, raised children, tended livestock, and if that wasn't enough, helped in the fields too. If she was lucky, she was called industrious. If she complained, she was called difficult. And if she died, she was replaced. Now, our Egyptian woman also worked. Don't imagine her lounging on a chaise with grapes and eyeliner, though, to be fair, eyeliner was common. She, too, rose with the sun and labored through the heat of the day. But the type of work she did, and the way her society saw it, was different. Let's start with economic visibility. In ancient Egypt, women worked in a variety of occupations, especially in the earlier dynasties. They could be weavers, bakers, brewers, perfume makers, musicians, dancers, midwives, wet nurses, even administrators of temple goods. Some women were scribes. Some managed estates. Some ran businesses out of their homes. Their labor was not just domestic, it was economic. In medieval Europe, especially in the countryside, women's work was essential but considered helping. She helped her husband, helped her father, helped the community, but was rarely credited as an independent worker. If she brewed ale, as many did, the profit was his. If she spun thread, also common, it was a household chore, not a trade. In Egypt, women could brew beer and own the brewery. They could weave linen and sell it at market. Their labor could translate directly into income and into property ownership. Even better, their names were sometimes attached to their work. There are tomb inscriptions that mention women by name for their skilled weaving, their high-quality baking, their management of food stores. That's not feminist utopia, but it's historical acknowledgement. A medieval woman, by contrast, appears in records mostly in relation to others. She is wife of, mother of, or occasionally, widow of. Her own profession, if she had one, was often undocumented. Now, let's talk about paid labor. In medieval towns, some women did work for wages. They were spinners, washerwomen, domestic servants, vendors, even prostitutes. But their wages were half, or less, than what men earned. Guilds often barred them from membership, and legal restrictions prevented them from operating independently in many trades. In Egypt, the economy was different. Women working for temples could be paid in grain or beer, the currency of daily life. They could be salaried members of temple households. They weren't always well paid, and certainly not always treated equally, but the formal acknowledgement of their labor was more direct. And here's the kicker: Egyptian women could keep their earnings. A medieval woman's wages, if she earned them, legally belonged to her husband. In Egypt, a woman's income remained hers, unless she chose to pool it into the household. Imagine that, working and keeping the money. Radical. Let's consider daily routines. A medieval woman might wake at 4:30 a.m., light the fire, bake the bread, milk the animals, dress the children, and then haul water from the well. That's before breakfast. Then she'd do laundry, by hand, of course, feed pigs, spin wool, cook lunch, help in the fields, and maybe stitch a shirt by candlelight before bed. She was never off. There was no weekend, no retirement. If she got sick, she worked sick. If she got pregnant, she worked pregnant. If she gave birth, she swaddled the baby and went back to work. In Egypt, the day started early too. The Nile dictated life, flooding seasons, planting cycles, harvest time. Women helped in the fields, yes, but they also worked within households that were structured differently. Extended families shared tasks. Communal baking ovens and neighborhood wells meant certain chores were less solitary, not easier, necessarily, but shared. And, crucially, depictions of Egyptian women sometimes show them resting, sitting, holding musical instruments, playing games. That doesn't mean leisure was widespread, but it suggests that female life wasn't entirely consumed by drudgery. Compare that to medieval art, where women are usually shown toiling, praying, or dying. Let's talk about status. In Europe, noblewomen did less physical labor but more surveillance labor, overseeing households, managing servants, arranging marriages, acting as hostesses, and performing endless rituals of courtly behavior. It was exhausting in a different way. In Egypt, elite women also managed households, and sometimes temples or estates. Some were royal scribes or treasurers. Queen Hatshepsut even ruled as pharaoh, dressing in male regalia. True, but ruling nonetheless. No European woman ruled England in her own name until Matilda tried, and failed, in the 12th century, nearly 2,000 years after Hatshepsut. Now let's go to the emotional labor. The medieval woman bore the burden of spiritual upkeep. She was told to maintain the family's moral compass. If her husband sinned, she was expected to pray him into heaven. If her children misbehaved, it was her fault. If the crops failed, she must not have prayed hard enough. And if she showed ambition, she was suspect. In Egypt, the emotional labor was different. Gods were everywhere, but they weren't watching you for sin. Morality was judged by Mot, the concept of cosmic order, truth, and balance. At death, your heart was weighed against a feather. Women participated in this spiritual economy, but they weren't individually blamed for every misfortune. A woman's failure to suffer silently was not seen as a divine failing. So now, let's drop our medieval woman into an Egyptian village. She sees a woman selling perfume at the market, and keeping the money. She sees women singing in a temple, paid in grain for their rituals. She sees a woman writing accounts for a household, and being respected for it. And she feels confused, maybe even embarrassed, because her entire life, her work was called duty, not skill, not labor, just expected silence and sweat. And the Egyptian woman, dropped into a medieval cottage. She sees women doing endless tasks for no pay, no credit, and no choice. She might ask, why don't they write your name on the cloth you wove? The medieval woman would shrug. It's not for me to be remembered. And that's the difference. In ancient Egypt, women's labor was sometimes recorded, sometimes honored, sometimes compensated. In medieval Europe, women's work was erased, romanticized, or moralized, but almost never valued. Which is why, if you gave the medieval woman a ledger and a pen, she wouldn't know where to start. No one ever asked her to count her own worth. Medicine, midwifery, and mortal peril. Let's talk about the most terrifying word in the ancient world, help. Not monster, not plague, not even taxes. Just that quiet, panicked cry that means someone's in trouble. And more often than not, that someone is a woman in labor. In both medieval Europe and ancient Egypt, the body was a battlefield, especially a woman's body. But the tools and treatments, the way society handled care, childbirth, and catastrophe, that's where the real differences start to bleed through. Let's begin with a medieval woman who's pregnant. She's not smiling. There's no glowing. She knows, statistically, that this might kill her. Childbirth in medieval Europe was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. If she didn't die from hemorrhaging, she might die from fever. If she survived the birth, the child might not. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, so was maternal mortality. And if anything went wrong, there wasn't much to be done. Most births happened at home, attended by midwives. These women were often experienced and skilled, but they weren't respected by the male-dominated medical establishment. In fact, later in the Middle Ages, midwives were increasingly viewed with suspicion, especially if they had herbal knowledge, or dared to work without clerical approval, because medicine, like everything else, was being swallowed by the church. And the church didn't like women with power over life and death. Now let's turn to ancient Egypt, where the situation wasn't exactly antiseptic, but it was different. Egyptian women also gave birth at home, usually squatting or kneeling on birthing bricks. They were attended by midwives, neighbors, and sometimes family members. There were spells, amulets, and incantations. Yes, but there were also instructions. There are papyri, literal medical texts, describing how to assist birth, how to diagnose pregnancy, and how to treat complications. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dating back to around 1800 BCE, lists over 30 treatments for women's reproductive health, including ways to treat uterine displacement, control bleeding, and manage fertility. That's almost 2,000 years before a European university taught anything about obstetrics. Egyptian medicine was a blend of practical remedies and spiritual protections. You might get a herbal compress and a chant, but that didn't make it superstition. It made it holistic, in the truest sense. The patient wasn't a sinner. She was a person with a body and a soul, both in need of care. In contrast, medieval medicine was deeply shaped by the church, and by the ancient Greek humoral theory. Illness wasn't just physical, it was moral. And for women, that morality came with judgment. If she suffered in childbirth, it was Eve's curse. If she died, it was God's will. Worse, if she dared to seek relief, say, from a local herbalist, she might find herself accused of witchcraft. Midwives who knew too much were dangerous. Women who gathered herbs were suspect. Healing was not a neutral act. It was political. It was theological. It was patriarchal. Meanwhile, in Egypt, female healers weren't hunted. They were honored. There's evidence of women serving as physicians, especially in earlier periods. One notable figure is Pusishit, who held the title Lady Overseer of the Female Physicians. That was over 4,000 years ago. Let that sink in. In Europe, the first formal female doctors didn't appear until centuries after the Middle Ages, and even then, they were rare exceptions. For most medieval women, healing was something done quietly, without license, and always under threat. Let's talk about contraception. In medieval Europe, contraception was at best frowned upon, and at worst condemned as sinful. The church stance was clear. Procreation was the purpose of marriage. Any attempt to prevent it, through herbs, devices, or abstinence, was suspect, which didn't stop women from trying. Recipes circulated quietly. Some involved herbs like pennyroyal or rue. Others were more imaginative, but none were officially sanctioned. And if discovered, the user could be punished. In ancient Egypt, there were documented contraceptive methods, including vaginal pessaries made from crocodile dung and honey. Not exactly FDA approved, but creative. The point is, fertility was something women managed. Not always safely, not always effectively, but openly. And then there's menstruation, that monthly reminder of being a woman in a world built for men. In medieval Europe, menstruation was cloaked in shame. It was rarely mentioned, often misunderstood, and almost always seen as unclean. Some religious texts claimed menstruating women shouldn't touch holy objects. Others warned they could spoil food, curdle milk, or cause crops to fail. So a woman suffering from cramps or irregular cycles, she prayed, or she suffered, or she visited an old widow with dried herbs, and a warning not to speak too loudly. In Egypt, menstrual blood wasn't celebrated, but it wasn't demonized. There's evidence of treatments for menstrual pain, recipes for regulating cycles, and a general acknowledgement that menstruation was a normal part of life, not a sin, not a curse, just biology. Now, let's look at general illness. In both societies, illness could strike at any moment. There were fevers, injuries, infections, but the response was different. In Egypt, physicians trained in temple schools had access to medical texts. Treatments included surgery, bandaging, cauterization, and a range of drugs derived from plants and minerals. They even performed dental work and set broken bones. There were specialists for eyes, stomachs, and yes, female health. In medieval Europe, most people were treated by barber surgeons, monks, or local wise women. Hospitals existed, but they were often more like hostels for the dying. Bleeding, purging, and praying were the standard treatments. And again, for women, access to any of this depended on their status, their virtue, and the approval of men. So let's imagine our medieval woman waking with a fever in ancient Egypt. She's brought to a temple physician. He takes her pulse, offers a tincture, maybe recites a prayer, but also gives her food, water, and rest. He doesn't ask if she's menstruating. He doesn't blame her sin. He treats her as a patient. She might not survive. Medicine was still rudimentary, but she would be seen. Now imagine the Egyptian woman falling ill in medieval Europe. She's taken to a priest. He sprinkles holy water, mutters Latin. If she cries out, she's told to confess. If she asks for a woman healer, she's told to repent. Her body isn't a patient. It's a battleground between God and the devil, and she's caught in the crossfire. So once again, we ask, why wouldn't a medieval woman last a day in ancient Egypt? Because in Egypt, her suffering wouldn't be spiritualized, it would be treated. Because in Egypt, she could give birth without being blamed for Eve. She could see a doctor and not need a man's permission. She could be a healer, and not a heretic. In medieval Europe, medicine was a prayer. In Egypt, it was a practice. And for a woman who spent her life apologizing for her body, that shift might feel miraculous or terrifying. But either way, it would change everything. Education, literacy, and who gets to read. If knowledge is power, then literacy is the key to the vault. And for most of human history, someone was standing in front of that vault door with arms crossed, saying, "Sorry, ladies, not for you." In both medieval Europe and ancient Egypt, literacy was rare. But rarity is not the same as restriction. The difference is who could learn, and who was allowed. Let's start with our medieval woman. If she's a peasant, the chances of her reading anything are near zero. Her world is oral, stories told at the hearth, prayers murmured at mass, gossip at the well. Books are rare, expensive, and written in Latin, a language she's never heard outside church. If she's a noble woman, things are slightly better. She may learn to read in the vernacular, Middle English, French, or German, depending on her region. But Latin, still unlikely. And writing, that's often reserved for monks, clerics, and men of learning. What about nuns? Now we're talking. Some convince educated girls in reading and writing. Some nuns were prolific scribes, even authors. Think of Hildegard of Bingen, as mystic, composer, writer, a rare gem in a very thick fog. But even Hildegard needed male clerical approval to publish her visions. Even her education was a gift granted by the church, not a right. And for most women, education stopped at the alphabet, if it started at all, because reading was dangerous. A literate woman might get ideas, and ideas, in a patriarchal society, are always a liability. Now, let's float gently down the Nile. In ancient Egypt, literacy was also rare, but differently so. Most people, men and women, were illiterate. Scribes were elite specialists, trained from youth in the art of writing hieroglyphs, hieratic, and later demotic scripts. Education was hard, tedious, and respected. But here's the twist. Some women were scribes. We know their names. We see them in tombs. Not many, but enough to prove that literacy wasn't impossible for women, or even discouraged in every case. The title, scribe, appears alongside female figures who worked in temple economies, kept records, and managed estate accounts. In fact, ancient Egyptian education, for those who received it, was pragmatic. It wasn't about salvation, it was about administration, and women could be administrators, especially in religious and household contexts. Let's say our Egyptian woman is born into a temple family. Her father's a scribe. Her mother works in the temple kitchen. She shows aptitude. She copies letters in the dust. Someone notices. Does she go to scribble school? Maybe. Does she learn to read inventory lists, household accounts, or hymns? Quite possibly. Her education might not look like a philosopher's, but it functions. She can read prayers. She can write receipts. She can understand contracts. And here's another key difference. Contracts. In medieval Europe, women were rarely taught to read contracts, deeds, or legal codes. If a widow needed to understand a will, she relied on a male relative. If she signed something, it was often under pressure, or without comprehension. In Egypt, women signed contracts, marriage contracts, divorce agreements, property transactions, and some of those contracts are preserved on papyri, complete with clauses that show they understood the terms. Reading, in that context, wasn't just literacy, it was agency. Now let's talk about writing. Medieval women were often kept from writing altogether. They might copy texts for devotional purposes, in convents, behind walls, in obedience. But to compose, that was dangerous. A woman writing her own words was a woman forming her own thoughts. And if she shared them, she might be accused of arrogance, or heresy, or worse, witchcraft. Think of Marjorie Kemp, whose spiritual autobiography was dictated to a scribe because she couldn't write. Her words survive only because she convinced a man to pen them, and she was mocked, harassed, and nearly jailed for having visions. In Egypt, writing was also professional, but again, less policed by gender in certain contexts. Women wrote letters. They managed household accounts. They used writing as a tool, not a threat. What about schooling? In medieval Europe, education was tied to the church. Boys studied in monasteries, cathedral schools, or, if wealthy, with tutors. Girls, only if they were lucky, rich, and obedient. Education was moral. It was meant to protect purity, not provoke thought. In Egypt, education, for the few who got it, was more vocational. It trained officials, not saints. And while men dominated the system, women weren't invisible. Let's imagine our medieval woman handed a reed brush and a roll of papyrus. She frowns. Where are the prayers? Her Egyptian teacher says, First we learn to count, then we list goods, then we learn to bless. She's confused. Where's the sin? Where's the shame? There isn't any. Education here is a function, not a judgment. Now imagine our Egyptian woman dropped into a medieval abbey. She finds herself in a scriptorium, surrounded by monks copying Latin texts. She asks to write a letter. They tell her to kneel and pray instead. She asks to read a scroll. They ask if she's possessed. She's stunned. But I manage a temple's pantry records. I know how to calculate beer rations. They don't care. Her skills are useless here. She doesn't know Latin. She doesn't know the saints. She doesn't know her place. That's the heart of it. In medieval Europe, a woman's education was about control. It was a leash disguised as a rosary. In Egypt, a woman's education, if she got one, was about utility. She learned what helped her function, manage, contribute. Neither society educated women widely, neither handed out diplomas like candy, but one treated education like a door, the other treated it like a wall, which is why a medieval woman, dropped into the script-filled world of Egypt, would feel dizzy, not because she couldn't read, but because she could have. She could have been taught, trusted, given a ledger and a stylus, not just a prayer book. And that difference, it changes everything. Marriage contracts, divorce, and who keeps the cat. Marriage, that big medieval institution, where two people promise, till death do us part, and then promptly start wondering if one of them gets to keep the furniture after. But marriage isn't just about romance or arguments over the thermostat. It's a legal contract, a social contract, a property contract, and a gender contract. So, what did marriage mean for medieval women, and how did it compare to their ancient Egyptian sisters? First, medieval women had very little say in the matter. From childhood, their futures were often planned by fathers or guardians. Marriage was a tool for alliances, property consolidation, and social climbing, or simply survival. The bride's family gave a dowry, money, land, or goods, to the groom's family, basically as a payment or insurance. The woman herself, not consulted. Once married, the husband had legal control over the wife's property, dowry, and even her person. She became, in legal terms, covered by her husband's identity, a concept called coverture. She lost many rights, her earnings, her possessions, her children, all under his authority. Now, what if she wanted out? Divorce was extremely difficult, nearly impossible in Catholic Europe. The Church tightly controlled marriage as a sacrament, forever. Annulments were rare and expensive, and usually granted only for very specific reasons, like consanguinity, to close blood relations, or impotence. A medieval woman trapped in a bad marriage had few legal options. Separation was possible in extreme cases, but she rarely retained custody of her children or her property. Now, let's travel back to ancient Egypt. Marriage was also a contract. But here's the shocker, it was usually written down. Yes, papyrus marriage contracts existed. They listed dowries, the rights of both spouses, and provisions for divorce. And here's the kicker. Egyptian women had legal standing in these contracts. They could own property before marriage and keep it after. Their dowries were legally protected. They could initiate divorce, keep custody of children, and even demand financial support. Imagine that. If the husband was abusive or neglectful, the wife could walk away and take her dowry back. Sometimes, the contracts included clauses about the return of specific possessions, even pets. Yes, pets. We often imagine medieval or ancient marriages as grim, joyless affairs. But some Egyptian contracts mention the wife's cats explicitly, her companions, protectors, and status symbols. She could keep them after a divorce. In medieval Europe, who kept the cat? Most likely the husband, or he simply ignored it. In Egypt, women's rights over marriage were legal realities, not just vague ideas. This made marriage a partnership, flawed, unequal, but with legal frameworks protecting women's interests. Now, why the difference? Partly, it's the legal cultures. Medieval Europe's legal system was patchy, slow, and deeply entwined with church doctrine. The church sought to preserve marriage as indissoluble and hierarchical, with the man in charge. Ancient Egypt's law was more pragmatic. It emphasized social order but allowed individuals, including women, some control over their lives. So, the medieval woman might live decades under a husband's thumb with no legal recourse. The Egyptian woman might leave a bad marriage with her property, children, and cats. And it wasn't just theory. Archaeologists have found divorce documents written by women, petitions filed, disputes resolved in courts, where women argued their cases. It's easy to imagine a medieval woman reading one of these contracts and feeling an intense mix of envy and disbelief. Now, a caveat. Marriage wasn't always happy in Egypt. Sometimes, wives were stuck too. Social pressures, economic realities, and family honor all limited true freedom, but at least the laws recognized women's rights. At least the system acknowledged their personhood. Back in medieval Europe, women's identity was largely wrapped up in their husbands' wills. So who kept the cat, really? The question is almost a joke, but it's also serious. Pets were companions, sometimes protectors, symbols of status and affection. To keep or lose them after divorce was a sign of who held power. And in that tiny detail, we see the wider truth. Ancient Egyptian women had some legal protections in marriage, even over their cats. Medieval women had very few. They couldn't just walk away. They couldn't keep their stuff. They couldn't keep their independence. Marriage was a trap more than a partnership. So when you imagine a medieval woman dropped into an ancient Egyptian marriage ceremony, what would she think? That's not a cage. That's a contract. A contract she could sign, read, and enforce. And that difference might save her life. Social freedoms and restrictions. Walking alone. Speaking out. Let's imagine a medieval woman leaving her house. It's a simple thing, right? Step outside. Walk to the market. Visit a neighbor. Breathe fresh air. But in medieval Europe, it was complicated. She didn't just walk out. She stepped into a world tightly monitored, by custom, by law, and by watchful eyes. First, her presence was regulated. Unaccompanied women were viewed with suspicion. Walking alone, especially in public spaces like markets or streets, could be dangerous, socially and physically. Women needed chaperones or male relatives for protection and reputation. Why? Because the world outside was assumed dangerous, not just because of criminals, but because of gossip, temptation, and moral judgment. A woman alone was a woman vulnerable to scandal. Her honor was a fragile thing, wrapped in rumors and reputations. If she was unmarried or widowed, the scrutiny intensified. A medieval woman might be told to stay inside, or go only with company. And if she spoke out, if she voiced opinions in public, she risked censure, mockery, or worse. Public speech was a male domain. Women's voices belonged to the private sphere, the home, the hearth, the confessional. Exceptions existed, as is, noblewomen, queens, but even they had to navigate a minefield of expectations. Now, cross the desert to ancient Egypt. What if our Egyptian woman stepped outside? She walked freely. Ancient Egyptian cities were busy, noisy places. Women were visible everywhere, in markets, temples, streets. There's evidence that women traveled alone, shopped, and socialized without male escorts. The legal system protected them. Harassment was punishable, and their honor wasn't defined solely by male control. If an Egyptian woman spoke in public, no one raised eyebrows. Women participated in religious ceremonies, festivals, and official events. They sang, danced, prayed, and sometimes even held positions of authority. The queen herself could wield enormous power. Think of Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh. That public visibility wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Women owned businesses, managed estates, and negotiated contracts in their own name. Walking alone wasn't a scandal, it was normal. Speaking out wasn't rebellion, it was participation. So, if a medieval woman suddenly found herself in ancient Egypt, how would she react to the freedom of movement, the absence of chaperones, the public voice? She might feel bewildered or liberated, but the medieval woman was raised to believe her safety, reputation, and even her salvation depended on staying quiet and invisible. Now, imagine the Egyptian woman dropped into medieval Europe. She walks down a crowded market street. Heads turn, whispers start. Is she unmarried? Who is she with? She tries to buy bread alone. The baker eyes her suspiciously. She raises her voice to ask a question. The crowd hushes. Someone says, "Mind your place, woman." And suddenly, her normal feels alien. Her freedom, a cage. Because medieval Europe cloaked women's social lives in layers of control, laws, customs, religion. Even clothing was regulated, colors, styles, fabrics dictated by class and gender norms, walking unescorted, speaking loudly, wearing improper attire. Those could be grounds for accusations of immorality or witchcraft. And that was no joke. Women accused of breaking social rules could face harsh punishments, public shaming, fines, imprisonment, or even death. In Egypt, women's social freedoms came with responsibilities and expectations, but not with threats of violence just for existing in public space. The medieval woman's world was built on fear. Fear of sin, fear of the unknown, fear of other women. The Egyptian woman's world was built on presence, acknowledgement that women were part of the public fabric. One society said, "Stay inside, be silent, be seen but not heard." The other said, "Come out, speak up, be part of this." It's no wonder a medieval woman dropped into ancient Egypt would feel stunned, and no wonder an Egyptian woman dropped into medieval Europe would feel suffocated. Because social freedoms shape lives. They shape health, happiness, even survival. And on this simple act, walking alone, speaking out, the divide between these two worlds is loud and clear. Legal rights and court cases. Justice for whom? If law is supposed to be blind, then it sure had some favorite children. In medieval Europe and ancient Egypt, and women weren't always among them. Let's talk about legal rights. What did it really mean for a woman to be protected by the law? In medieval Europe, legal rights for women were complicated. On paper, some protections existed, but in practice, the law was heavily stacked against women, especially peasants. Women were often seen as legal minors, dependents of their fathers or husbands. If a woman was accused of a crime, the legal system might be harsher or more dismissive depending on her social status. For example, a noblewoman caught stealing might receive a lighter sentence than a peasant woman. And speaking of peasants, their chances of successfully defending themselves in court were slim. Women could testify, but their testimony was often discounted, especially if it contradicted a man's word. If a medieval woman was abused or wronged, she had few options. Local courts were dominated by men, judges, juries, officials, who often saw women as unreliable or morally suspect. Inheritance laws favored male heirs. Widows had some rights to dower, a life interest in a portion of the husband's property, but even that was limited and contested. Now, let's flip to ancient Egypt. The Egyptian legal system was surprisingly sophisticated. Women had full legal capacity. They could sue and be sued, own and manage property, make contracts, and represent themselves in court. And the courts actually heard their cases. We have papyri records of women bringing legal actions against husbands, family members, and even officials. They argued inheritance claims, property disputes, and personal grievances. Unlike medieval Europe, where the church's moral authority often overshadowed secular law, Egyptian law was more pragmatic. It dealt with daily life, property, and social order. And women had a voice. Court officials, judges, scribes, and witnesses recorded the proceedings, and women's testimonies carried weight. Of course, social status mattered. Elite women had more influence and resources to pursue legal cases, but even common women could access courts. Imagine a medieval woman whose husband abandoned her or refused to provide support. She might have no legal recourse. Her property would revert to male relatives, but an Egyptian woman in the same situation could file a claim, ask for restitution, or demand divorce. We even have cases where women successfully challenged male relatives over inheritance, and the courts listened. But it wasn't all justice and fairness. The legal system was still patriarchal. Women faced social pressures and limitations. Violence against women wasn't eliminated by laws, but the recognition of women as legal individuals made a huge difference. Now, consider a medieval woman watching a court session in ancient Egypt. She'd see women standing confidently, speaking their minds, challenging men, asserting rights. She'd feel the power of the law used as a shield, not a cage. And consider an Egyptian woman dropped into a medieval European court. She'd see judges ignoring her testimony, lawyers dismissing her, and a church tribunal framing her as morally suspect. She'd realize the law wasn't on her side. Legal rights shape lives. They determine who can protect themselves and who remains vulnerable. Between medieval Europe and ancient Egypt, The difference was striking. One system made women invisible. The other gave them a seat at the table. Health and medical care. Who got help? When it comes to survival, health and medical care are the silent heroes, or villains in the story. For women in medieval Europe and ancient Egypt, getting help when sick wasn't just about convenience. It could be a matter of life and death. In medieval Europe, medical knowledge was a patchwork of superstition, religious rituals, and limited practical understanding. The medical world was dominated by men, mostly clergy, or university-trained physicians. But these experts were rare, expensive, and concentrated in towns and cities. For the majority of women, especially peasants, care came from midwives, family members, or local herbalists. These midwives were skilled in many ways, especially in childbirth, arguably the riskiest moment in a medieval woman's life. But they walked a dangerous line. If a birth went wrong, or a baby died, they could easily be accused of witchcraft or malpractice. Access to professional medical care was a luxury few women could afford, or even reach, especially in rural areas. Noblewomen might receive visits from physicians or apothecaries, but peasants often had to rely on home remedies, passed down knowledge, or prayers. This mix of limited medicine and suspicion meant many women's illnesses went untreated, or were worsened by ineffective or dangerous cures. Death in childbirth, infections, or chronic ailments were tragically common. Now, let's cross continents and centuries to ancient Egypt, where things looked surprisingly different. Egyptian medicine was sophisticated for its time, combining empirical observation with spiritual belief. Doctors, both men and women, studied anatomy, treated wounds, and diagnosed illnesses with a surprising degree of accuracy. The survival of medical papyri, like the famous Edwin Smith and Ebers papyri, reveals detailed treatments ranging from wound care to surgeries and herbal remedies. Women in Egypt weren't just patients. Some were trained healers, midwives, or priests serving the gods of health, like Hathor and Sekhmet. These priestesses and healers played key roles in healthcare, blending ritual with practical treatment. Pregnant women likely had prenatal care, and childbirth, while still dangerous, had better outcomes thanks to midwives and healers with recognized skills. Healing temples served as early hospitals, offering care across social classes. Unlike medieval Europe, where hospitals were often religious institutions focusing more on spiritual healing than physical cures, Egyptian medical care was more accessible, with the temple system providing a network of healing centers, where women could seek help beyond their homes. If a medieval woman suddenly found herself in the care of an Egyptian doctor, she might be astonished at the practical, hands-on treatments, clean bandages, ointments, and even surgeries. She might feel a mixture of relief and disbelief that her pain and illness were approached not just with prayer, but with actual medicine. Conversely, an Egyptian woman thrust into a medieval village might quickly despair at the lack of formal medical practitioners, the superstitions dominating healthcare, and the precarious reliance on folk remedies, and midwives who were often mistrusted or accused of witchcraft. Neither system was perfect. Disease, infection, and death were universal challenges, but the difference in access and cultural attitudes toward women's healthcare was stark. In ancient Egypt, women had a somewhat better chance of receiving care from trained healers and participating in healing rituals that combined body and spirit. Medieval European women faced multiple barriers. Gender, class, and religious strictures often limited their options and exposed them to suspicion or neglect. Healthcare, then, was not just about biology or medicine. It was a reflection of society's values, its gender dynamics, and who was seen as worthy of care. These factors profoundly shaped women's survival, well-being, and autonomy. For a medieval woman, the struggle to access medical help could be a daily battle against ignorance and fear. For an Egyptian woman, while risks remained, a system existed that at least recognized her needs as a patient and provided institutional support. Understanding these differences reminds us how much culture and law influence even the most basic human experiences, like getting well when sick. Religion and spiritual authority. Who's the boss? Religion in medieval Europe wasn't just a belief system. It was the entire framework for social order, law, and gender roles. For women, this meant their lives were largely shaped by religious doctrine that stressed obedience, chastity, and submission. The church was the ultimate authority on morality and behavior. Women were expected to be pious, modest, and silent. The Virgin Mary was the ideal, pure, obedient, and nurturing, but mostly unattainable for ordinary women stuck in patriarchal realities. Religious leaders, all men, held the keys to salvation and spiritual authority. Women were often excluded from formal religious roles. Nuns and asses were exceptions, but their power was circumscribed within convent walls. Even then, their autonomy was limited by male bishops and church hierarchy. Women's spirituality was closely tied to their roles as wives and mothers. The church viewed female sexuality as dangerous and sinful, often associating women with temptation and moral weakness. Confession, penance, and strict controls over marriage and sexuality kept women under religious surveillance. The fear of eternal damnation was a powerful tool, ensuring women's compliance with social norms. For medieval women, religion was both a source of comfort and control, a paradox that defined much of their daily lives. Meanwhile, ancient Egypt had a very different religious landscape. Religion permeated all aspects of life, but women had a much more visible and active spiritual role. Egyptian goddesses like Isis, Hathor, and Mot were central figures representing motherhood, fertility, justice, and truth. Women could serve as priestesses in temples, sometimes wielding considerable influence in religious ceremonies and rituals. The concept of Mot, harmony, balance, and justice, was fundamental, and women were seen as part of maintaining this cosmic order. Unlike medieval Europe, where women's religious participation was limited, Egyptian women could hold offices, own temple property, and engage directly with the divine. Queens, like Nefertiti and Hatshepsut, were often portrayed as divine intermediaries, blending political and spiritual authority. Religion wasn't just a male domain, it was a sphere where women could exercise power and gain respect. This spiritual inclusion had real social implications. Women's voices mattered in rituals, prayers, and temple management. Their roles were diverse, from musicians and dancers in ceremonies to high-ranking priestesses advising pharaohs. If a medieval woman found herself in ancient Egypt, she might be stunned by this spiritual freedom and authority. The idea that a woman could hold religious office, own temple land, or be a goddess incarnate would seem revolutionary. Conversely, an Egyptian woman dropped into medieval Europe might feel confined by the strict church hierarchy, the lack of female religious leadership, and the moral expectations that silenced her voice. Religion shaped how women saw themselves and were seen by others. In medieval Europe, it reinforced their subordinate status. In Egypt, it could be a source of empowerment and respect. These differences show how theology and practice intersected with gender, affecting women's roles in society and their personal identities. Religion wasn't just faith, it was political power, social order, and gender politics rolled into one. And on this spiritual battlefield, medieval women and Egyptian women stood worlds apart. Education and literacy. Can you read this? Education is power, or at least, that's what it says on every motivational poster ever. But for medieval and ancient Egyptian women, the reality of learning to read and write was worlds apart. In medieval Europe, literacy was a rare skill, heavily tied to social status and gender. Most women, especially commoners, never saw a book. The church controlled education, and schooling for girls was limited, often focusing on domestic skills rather than reading or writing. Noble girls might attend convent schools, where they learned to read religious texts, and maybe write a little Latin, but even that was limited. The prevailing attitude was that a woman's role didn't require literacy. Her value was in obedience, household management, and childbearing, not intellectual pursuits. Books were expensive, and schools were mostly for boys destined for clerical or noble careers. Literacy among women was associated with either exceptional status or unusual circumstances, like being a nun or a member of the aristocracy. For most medieval women, education was a distant luxury, their names rarely appearing in written records beyond legal or church documents. In stark contrast, ancient Egypt placed a much higher value on literacy, even for women. Writing was central to administration, religion, and culture. While literacy wasn't universal, evidence shows that some women, especially those in elite or priestly families, learned to read and write hieroglyphs, hieratic, or demotic scripts. Women could be scribes, a prestigious profession mostly dominated by men but not closed to talented women. Being able to read and write opened doors to administrative roles, religious service, and social mobility. Even outside elite circles, inscriptions and tomb texts sometimes included women's names and accomplishments, reflecting recognition of their literate identities. Literacy was a tool not only for survival but for influence and legacy. Education for women in Egypt wasn't just about passive reception. Some women actively engaged in writing, record keeping, and correspondence. This access to knowledge made a big difference in how women navigated their society, claimed property, and exercised personal agency. Imagine a medieval woman suddenly placed in an Egyptian scribe's workshop. She would likely be amazed by the value placed on literacy, the presence of women learning alongside men, and the practical uses of writing in daily life. Conversely, an Egyptian woman dropped into a medieval European village might find the lack of educational opportunities for women baffling, frustrating, and suffocating. The absence of literacy cut women off from power, legal rights, and religious understanding. It enforced their invisibility in official records and limited their ability to influence their own lives. Education shaped how women were viewed and how much control they had over their destinies. It was a gatekeeper, and in this gatekeeping role, medieval Europe and ancient Egypt again diverged dramatically. In the end, the ability to read and write was more than just a skill. It was a reflection of societal values and the roles women were allowed to play. Ancient Egypt gave some women the tools to write their own stories, while medieval Europe mostly kept women silent in the margins. That gap speaks volumes about how these two worlds treated half their population, and why medieval women really wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Fashion and personal autonomy. What you wear says what you are. Clothes aren't just about keeping warm or looking nice. They're a statement, a form of social currency, and sometimes a straight-up rulebook for how to behave. For women in medieval Europe and ancient Egypt, fashion was deeply tied to their social status, roles, and autonomy. But the rules around what women could and couldn't wear reveal a lot about how much freedom they actually had. In medieval Europe, women's fashion was largely dictated by social class and, crucially, by moral and religious expectations. Sumptuary laws, strict rules about who could wear what, were common across Europe. These laws were designed to maintain social hierarchies and prevent common people from dressing like nobles. For women, this meant not only the colors and fabrics but also the style had to signal modesty and submission. Long sleeves, high necklines, and layers upon layers were the norm, all designed to hide the body and discourage any display of sexuality. A woman's dress was often a public statement of her virtue and her obedience to societal norms. The church's influence on fashion was enormous. Immodest or flashy dress could be condemned as sinful or scandalous. Hair, too, was controlled. Married women were expected to cover their hair, signaling their marital status and submission. Women had very little say in these sartorial rules. Their clothes reflected their husbands' or fathers' wishes as much as their own identity. Personal autonomy was limited, and fashion was a tool of social control. Meanwhile, ancient Egyptian women had a very different relationship with clothing and personal expression. Egypt's hot climate influenced practical choices. Light linen, often sheer, was common. But beyond practicality, fashion was also about status and identity. Egyptian women wore simple but elegant dresses, often pleated or draped, that allowed freedom of movement and comfort in the heat. Jewelry was abundant and important. Gold bracelets, necklaces, and elaborate wigs were worn by women of all classes, symbolizing beauty, wealth, and divine favor. Egyptian art and text suggest that women had more freedom to express personal style, with a greater focus on adornment than concealment. Hair was an important fashion statement. Wigs and elaborate hairstyles were popular, and women took pride in their appearance. While modesty was valued, it wasn't about hiding the body but celebrating it in socially accepted ways. Egyptian fashion was tied to religious symbolism, too. Certain colors and styles were linked to gods or concepts like fertility and rebirth. This meant clothing could be a form of spiritual expression, not just social signaling. If a medieval European woman found herself in ancient Egypt, she might feel liberated by the lighter clothing, the jewelry, and the personal freedom to decorate and style herself. She might appreciate the cultural acceptance of beauty and femininity as a form of strength rather than something to be hidden or controlled. Conversely, an Egyptian woman suddenly living in medieval Europe might feel suffocated by heavy layers, restrictions on color and style, and the pressure to cover up completely. The stark differences in fashion reflected deeper social values. Medieval Europe emphasized control, hierarchy, and submission, while ancient Egypt celebrated beauty, status, and personal expression within a structured but less repressive system. Fashion wasn't just about fabric and thread, it was about autonomy, identity, and power. For medieval women, what they wore often reinforced their social invisibility and lack of control. For Egyptian women, fashion was a tool of self-expression, status, and spiritual identity. So, when you look at the clothes, you see more than just style. You see the very different worlds these women lived in, and why medieval women wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Family and social networks. Who's got your back? Family and social connections have always been survival tools, especially for women in societies where their individual power was limited. But the nature of these networks, who supported whom, and how, varied dramatically between medieval Europe and ancient Egypt. Understanding these differences reveals a lot about why medieval women, isolated and constrained, wouldn't last a day in the more connected and flexible world of ancient Egypt. In medieval Europe, family was often a hierarchical, patriarchal institution. Women's roles were defined primarily by their relationships to men, daughter, wife, mother. Their social value and security depended on these ties. Marriage was usually arranged, a transaction between families to secure alliances, land, or wealth. Women were expected to be obedient and faithful, and their primary duties were domestic, bearing children, managing the household, and supporting their husbands. Extended family networks were important, but women's autonomy within them was limited. Widows could sometimes manage property or negotiate on behalf of children, but often male relatives, fathers, brothers, sons, oversaw these responsibilities. Social support was patchy, especially for lower-class women. Peasant women relied on neighbors and local communities, but poverty and hardship were common, and women without strong family ties could quickly fall into destitution. The church provided some relief through charitable institutions, but these were often distant and insufficient. In general, medieval women's social safety net was fragile and heavily dependent on men. Contrast this with ancient Egypt, where family and social networks were more flexible and women enjoyed a greater degree of independence. Egyptian women had legal rights to own and inherit property, which gave them economic footing within their families. Marriage was important but not strictly binding. Divorce was relatively common and socially accepted, giving women more control over their personal lives. Extended family ties mattered, but women could act independently in legal and economic matters, enabling them to build their own support networks. Women often managed their own households, especially if widowed or divorced, and could pass property to children or relatives. Social connections extended beyond kinship to include temple communities and trade networks. Women's roles in religious and economic life created additional layers of social support. For example, priestesses, merchants, and artisans could form alliances and friendships outside the family, creating a web of mutual aid. This autonomy meant that even women without close family ties could navigate society more successfully than their medieval counterparts. If a medieval woman were transported to ancient Egypt, she might be shocked by the relative freedom women had to control their family and social lives. The ability to own property, initiate divorce, and maintain independent economic activity would be liberating. She might find the social safety net stronger and more accessible, with multiple avenues of support beyond marriage or family. On the other hand, an Egyptian woman dropped into medieval Europe might feel trapped by rigid family structures, dependence on male relatives, and limited social options. The strict gender roles and fragile safety nets would leave her vulnerable in a way that would be alien to her experience back home. Family and social networks are more than just relationships, they're lifelines. They shape how women live, survive, and thrive. The contrast between medieval Europe and ancient Egypt highlights how societal structures either constrain or empower women. For medieval women, family was often both support and cage. For Egyptian women, it was a more flexible, empowering web of connections. This difference helped determine not just survival, but quality of life. So when you ask why medieval women wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt, part of the answer lies in these networks. Who's got your back, and how much power you have to call on it. Work and economic roles. Who paid the bills? When it comes to survival, knowing who did the work and who earned the money can make or break a day in any woman's life, especially in societies as different as medieval Europe and ancient Egypt. For women, work was not just a necessity, but a measure of their independence and value. So, let's unpack how medieval and Egyptian women earned their keep, and how that shaped their lives. In medieval Europe, the world of work for women was often defined by status and geography. For most rural women, labor was relentless and physical, working the land alongside their husbands, tending animals, gathering firewood, and managing household chores that consumed every waking hour. The economy was largely agrarian, so survival depended on hard, daily toil. Peasant women didn't have the luxury of choosing their jobs. Survival meant doing whatever was needed, from spinning wool to brewing ale. Yet despite this endless labor, medieval women had limited economic power. Property and money were mostly controlled by men, fathers, husbands, or lords. Even when women worked hard, their earnings rarely belonged to them. Widows or unmarried women might have more control, but the law often pushed wealth into male hands. In towns and cities, things could look a bit different. Some women worked as merchants, artisans, or shopkeepers, especially widows who inherited businesses. Guilds, which regulated trades, were usually male-dominated, but some guilds admitted women or allowed widows to continue their husbands' trades. These women could achieve a degree of economic independence, though this was the exception rather than the rule. Women also worked as servants, laundresses, or in markets selling goods. Still, even in these roles, societal and legal restrictions limited women's ability to own property or make contracts without a male guardian. The medieval economy's structure reflected a broader social system that kept women in subordinate roles, economically dependent and vulnerable. Ancient Egypt offers a strikingly different picture. Egyptian women were active economic agents in many ways. They worked as weavers, bakers, perfume makers, and merchants. There's evidence of women owning shops and land, lending money, and participating in trade. Unlike in medieval Europe, Egyptian law recognized women's property rights clearly. Women could buy and sell goods, enter contracts, and inherit wealth independently. This legal autonomy meant that women's work was often directly tied to their economic freedom. For example, a woman running a bakery could legally own her shop and profits, giving her a financial foothold in society. Women could also work as artisans or even scribes, and some held positions in temple economies, which were major economic centers. The temple estates employed both men and women, allowing women to engage in skilled labor and administrative roles. The Egyptian economy's flexibility extended into family and marriage arrangements too. Since women could control property, they had more bargaining power within households and could survive independently if widowed or divorced. Economic roles weren't strictly gendered as in medieval Europe. Women's participation was recognized and valued. Artifacts and papyri reveal women receiving wages or payments for work, buying slaves, or lending money. This economic participation gave Egyptian women more autonomy and social standing. It wasn't just survival through labor, it was survival through recognized and protected economic rights. Now, imagine a medieval woman suddenly dropped into an Egyptian marketplace or temple estate. She might be amazed at the freedom women had to work openly, own property, and conduct business. The ability to earn and keep money could be life-changing for someone used to economic dependence. Conversely, an Egyptian woman transported to medieval Europe might feel trapped by legal restrictions, social expectations, and economic barriers that limited women's ability to support themselves or control property. The contrast in women's economic roles is a striking part of why medieval women might struggle to last a day in ancient Egypt. Work wasn't just about money, it was a marker of independence, respect, and survival. In medieval Europe, women's work was essential but often invisible and undervalued. Economic power was generally out of reach, and legal restrictions kept women dependent. In ancient Egypt, women's economic roles were more visible, protected, and autonomous, offering a foundation for personal freedom and social influence. This economic reality shaped everything from family dynamics to legal rights and personal safety. Understanding who paid the bills and who got to keep the change helps us see the broader picture of women's lives across these civilizations. It's not just about surviving the day, but about the systems that shaped women's power to survive and thrive. For medieval women, economic dependence was a cage. For Egyptian women, economic participation was a path to freedom. And that's why medieval women wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Marriage and divorce. Chains or choices. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership, right? But depending on where and when you live, it can look more like a cage, a contract, or sometimes even a battlefield. For women in medieval Europe and ancient Egypt, marriage shaped their entire lives, but the rules and realities couldn't be more different. Understanding those differences shines a bright light on why medieval women wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Starting with medieval Europe, marriage was mostly about control of property, lineage, and power. For women, marriage was often less about love and more about duty. Families arranged marriages to secure alliances, transfer land, or maintain social status. The woman's consent wasn't always a priority. In some cases, it was barely considered. Once married, a woman's legal identity effectively merged into her husband's, a concept called coverture. She couldn't own property independently, make contracts, or manage money without her husband's permission. This legal absorption wasn't just paperwork, it dictated daily life, social standing, and personal freedom. The church reinforced marriage as indissoluble and a sacred sacrament, meaning divorce was practically impossible except in rare cases of annulment, usually favoring men. Women stuck in unhappy or abusive marriages had little legal recourse and were socially pressured to endure. Widows sometimes gained more autonomy, but even then, their freedom was often circumscribed. The expectations within medieval marriage were strict. Wives were expected to be obedient, faithful, and devoted to household duties. Sexual fidelity was enforced mostly on women, while men's extramarital affairs were often overlooked or quietly accepted. The church's moral teachings reinforced a vision of marriage, where women were subordinate helpers, their main purpose to bear children, especially sons, and manage the household. This lack of personal autonomy in marriage meant that many medieval women lived under constant legal and social constraints, with their futures largely shaped by family arrangements and the will of their husbands. Ancient Egypt, by contrast, offers a surprisingly flexible picture of marriage and divorce. While marriage was important for social stability and family, Egyptian women had significantly more rights within the relationship. Marriages were usually monogamous, but women could initiate divorce and often retained the right to property and custody of children after separation. Egyptian law explicitly allowed for divorce on various grounds, including neglect or abuse. This meant women weren't trapped in unhappy marriages to the same degree as in medieval Europe. They could remarry or live independently, and widows had legal protections to inherit and manage property. Unlike the European model of coverture, Egyptian women maintained separate legal identities within marriage. Contracts spelled out mutual responsibilities and property rights, often safeguarding women's interests. Marriage was more of a partnership than a one-sided arrangement. The flexibility in Egyptian marriage laws meant women had more control over their lives. Social expectations valued fidelity and family, but women's rights were recognized and legally protected. Egyptian women could negotiate marriage contracts, stipulating property settlements or support agreements. The fact that women could dissolve marriages and retain property meant they were less vulnerable to exploitation or abandonment. This legal framework gave women real power to shape their lives and protect themselves. Imagine a medieval woman suddenly waking up in ancient Egypt and discovering she could walk away from a bad marriage, keep her property, and raise her children with legal rights intact. The freedom to say no or enough would be revolutionary. Conversely, an Egyptian woman dropped into medieval Europe would likely feel trapped, forced to endure a lifetime of submission, with little legal protection or option to leave. The indissolubility of marriage combined with social and religious pressure would be stifling and dangerous. Marriage wasn't just a social contract, it was a battleground for women's autonomy. Medieval European women were bound tightly by laws, customs, and religious doctrine that prioritized male authority and female obedience. Ancient Egyptian women, while still navigating patriarchal norms, enjoyed a surprising degree of legal independence and personal choice. This difference in marriage laws and customs helped define women's roles, rights, and everyday realities, and why medieval women simply wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Childbirth and motherhood, the ultimate test. Childbirth has always been one of the most challenging and defining experiences in a woman's life. But the way societies viewed and managed pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood reveals a lot about how much value they placed on women beyond reproduction, and how much power women actually had over their bodies and families. Medieval Europe and ancient Egypt offer two very different stories, and the contrast is eye-opening. In medieval Europe, childbirth was perilous, often shrouded in fear and superstition. Medical knowledge was limited, and many births happened at home with the help of midwives who relied on traditional remedies, prayers, and folklore. The church played a huge role in how childbirth was understood. Pain and suffering during childbirth were often framed as punishment for original sin, reinforcing the idea that women's bodies were inherently flawed and sinful. This religious lens shaped attitudes toward motherhood, which was considered a woman's primary purpose, but also a dangerous trial she had to endure. Infant and maternal mortality rates were high, making childbirth a constant source of anxiety. Once a child was born, motherhood in medieval Europe was demanding and restrictive. Women were expected to dedicate themselves to raising children, especially sons who would carry on the family name and inherit property. Mothers had little formal support, extended families helped, but women bore the brunt of child rearing and domestic duties. The church emphasized obedience and discipline in raising children, with strict moral codes. Mothers were often socially judged by their children's behavior and success, adding pressure to their already heavy workload. The fear of losing children to disease or malnutrition was common, and women had few resources to mitigate these risks. Overall, motherhood was a mix of revered duty and harsh reality, shaped by limited medical knowledge and rigid social norms. Now, ancient Egypt paints a somewhat different picture. While childbirth was still risky, medical texts from Egypt show that midwives and doctors had a surprisingly advanced understanding of pregnancy and labor. They used herbal remedies, massages, and even early surgical techniques. Ancient Egyptian religion portrayed childbirth more positively, linking it to creation and rebirth. Goddesses like Isis were seen as protectors of mothers and children, and prayers and amulets were used to ensure safe delivery. This spiritual dimension gave women a sense of empowerment rather than punishment during childbirth. Motherhood in Egypt was highly valued, but women also had legal rights related to their children. Mothers could inherit property and pass it to their children, and maternal bonds were recognized in legal contracts and inheritance laws. Children were seen as a blessing but also a social responsibility. Families were often extended, with grandparents, aunts, and uncles playing active roles in upbringing. Women had some influence in family decisions, especially if they managed property or held economic power. This broader support network eased the burden of motherhood, compared to the isolating experience medieval women often faced. If a medieval woman found herself in ancient Egypt, she might be surprised and relieved by the more supportive medical knowledge and spiritual framing of childbirth. The practical help from midwives and doctors and the recognition of motherhood as part of a cosmic cycle rather than punishment would be liberating. Conversely, an Egyptian woman in medieval Europe might be overwhelmed by the fear-driven, punitive attitudes towards childbirth and the lack of medical support. The high risks and social pressures would be suffocating and isolating. Childbirth and motherhood are the ultimate tests of endurance, but they're also windows into how societies value and support women. Medieval Europe's approach reflected its harsh realities and religious worldview that often constrained women. Ancient Egypt's system combined practical knowledge, spiritual meaning, and legal protections to give women more agency and support. This difference not only affected women's survival, but also their sense of self and place in society. So when we ask why medieval women wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt, we have to remember the profound difference in how these cultures treated the most critical moments of women's lives, the creation and nurturing of the next generation. Legal rights and justice. Can you fight back? Imagine you get robbed, cheated, or even abused. Can you do anything about it? Can you stand up for yourself in court or get justice? When it comes to women in medieval Europe versus ancient Egypt, the answer isn't just yes or no. It's a wild contrast that shows just how much power women really had in their societies. Spoiler alert, medieval women had a rougher time. In medieval Europe, legal rights for women were often limited, confusing, and heavily influenced by their social status and marital state. Women were generally seen as legal minors, under the authority of their fathers, husbands, or male guardians. This meant their ability to own property, make contracts, or represent themselves in court was severely restricted. For example, married women were under coverture, where their legal identity was merged with their husbands, effectively silencing them in legal matters. If a woman wanted to sue someone or defend herself, she usually needed a male representative to act on her behalf. Widows and unmarried women had a bit more freedom to engage legally, but even then, they were often limited by custom or local laws. The medieval legal system was also biased in favor of men. Courts prioritized male testimony, and women's claims of abuse or injustice were frequently dismissed or downplayed. Violence against women, including domestic abuse, was often treated as a private family matter rather than a criminal offense. The church courts, which handled moral and family matters, could be strict about enforcing female obedience, but offered little protection for women's rights. Punishments for women who broke social or moral codes, like adultery, were often harsh and public, reinforcing control through fear and humiliation. Access to justice was complicated by literacy and wealth. Most women, especially peasants, couldn't read or write, so navigating the legal system was nearly impossible without male help. The wealthy had more resources but still faced the same structural barriers. Women's voices were marginalized in law and society, reinforcing their subordinate status. Ancient Egypt, however, offered women a surprisingly different legal landscape. Egyptian law recognized women as legal individuals capable of owning property, signing contracts, and representing themselves in court. Women could initiate lawsuits, defend their rights, and even serve as witnesses. This legal recognition wasn't just theoretical, it was enforced in daily life and official records. For example, papyri show women suing for property disputes, wages, or divorce settlements and winning cases. Egyptian courts treated women's testimony seriously, and legal contracts often included both spouses' signatures, reflecting mutual recognition. Violence against women in Egypt was not ignored, and women had legal means to seek protection or redress. While patriarchal norms still existed, the law provided tools for women to fight back against abuse or injustice. This didn't mean women were completely equal to men, but they had far more legal agency and protection than their medieval European counterparts. The legal status of women in ancient Egypt extended beyond the courts. Property rights were well established, allowing women to inherit, buy, sell, and manage assets independently. This economic power reinforced their legal standing and social influence. Women could draft wills, lend money, and engage in business contracts, often acting as heads of households. These rights provided women with real leverage in their communities and families. If a medieval woman suddenly found herself in an Egyptian court, she might be shocked at how seriously the law took her words and rights. The ability to represent herself, own property, and seek justice would be empowering, almost unimaginable, compared to her experience back home. Conversely, an Egyptian woman thrust into a medieval European court would likely feel silenced and vulnerable, her rights ignored or overridden by male authority. Legal rights and justice aren't abstract concepts, they shape daily life, safety, and dignity. For medieval women, the law was often a tool of control and limitation. For Egyptian women, it was a shield and a sword, a way to assert their place in society. This fundamental difference in legal recognition is one of the clearest reasons medieval women wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Worlds apart, why medieval women wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. So, we've taken a slow, sleepy stroll through two vastly different worlds, medieval Europe and ancient Egypt, by looking at what life was really like for women, from waking up with church bells and strict rules to greeting the Nile with surprising freedoms. It's clear these civilizations were centuries and mindsets apart. And when you put a medieval woman in ancient Egypt, The differences would be enough to make her last a day, or even an hour, a steep, nearly impossible challenge. Throughout this journey, we saw how medieval women lived in a world shaped by rigid hierarchy, legal limitations, and harsh social expectations. Their days were filled with endless labor, their voices often silenced by law and custom. Marriage was a contract mostly controlled by men, and divorce was nearly unthinkable. Childbirth was a perilous trial wrapped in religious guilt, and motherhood was a tough, isolating responsibility. Work often meant toiling without owning, and justice was elusive. All these factors combined to create a life circumscribed by dependency and control. Ancient Egyptian women, on the other hand, had a legal and social framework that offered more rights, autonomy, and recognition. They could own property, make contracts, and participate actively in economic and legal life. Marriage was a partnership with real options for divorce and property protection. Childbirth was approached with a blend of practical medicine and religious reverence that empowered women. Motherhood was supported by family and law, not just duty. And when injustice struck, Egyptian women had legal recourse that gave them a fighting chance. This contrast isn't just about history trivia, it reveals how deeply culture, religion, and law shape women's lives. Medieval Europe's patriarchal system was harsh and often unforgiving, leaving many women vulnerable and voiceless. Ancient Egypt, while still a patriarchal society, created spaces for women's independence and authority, allowing them to survive, and sometimes thrive, in ways medieval women could only dream of. So why wouldn't a medieval woman last a day in ancient Egypt? Because the entire structure of her life, from laws to daily routines, from marriage to motherhood, was built on limits that Egyptian women didn't face in the same way. She'd find herself unable to claim property, silenced in court, trapped in marriage, and isolated in childbirth. The shock of that freedom, alongside the expectations and rights Egyptian women had, would be overwhelming. History often feels like a slow, dusty march through the ages, but when you zoom in on women's lives, it becomes a vivid story of survival, power, and struggle. The tale of medieval versus Egyptian women isn't just about who lasted longer, it's about how societies built those rules, and how women navigated them. It's a reminder that history isn't the same for everyone, and that the past holds lessons about freedom, rights, and dignity that still matter today. Thanks for joining me on this slow, boring history trip. Sleep well, knowing that sometimes, surviving history takes more than just a day.